This video is going to be very different from any I've done so far. It is provocative, but with good intentions. My aim is to push people to look beyond the very shallow history that appears far too often these days, especially on the internet, though also in some so-called popular history books, and instead to read some of the many great works that have been published on Gaelic Ireland. A lot of amazing work is being done on Gaelic and Irish history at the moment. Many of these books are available in your local library, so go there and get reading. Gaelic Ireland and its history are fascinating. You can find wonderful mythology and legends, mysteries, artifacts, ancient ruins, illuminated manuscripts, great literature, especially poetry, and all sorts of historical events, battles, fights, betrayals, sex, immigration, exile, victories, defeats, great joy, and at times endless sorrow. Ireland is fortunate to have this in its history. However, following the defeat of Hugh O'Neill's Gaelic Confederacy in the 9 Years' War and the brutal Confederate and Cromwellian Wars in the mid-17th century, Gaelic Ireland was destroyed. The results of this were worsened by the decline of the Irish language. Indeed, the Gaelic culture which existed until the 17th century is now lost to us to a great extent. When reading the so-called bardic poetry or any Gaelic literature, the problem of how to interpret and understand it has to be faced, especially given the destruction of the cultural and political framework in which this was written. The same applies to Gaelic mythology and legends. Indeed, without a knowledge of Old Irish and Gaelic history, can anyone really understand this mythology? With Gaelic poetry, the problem is even worse. Unfortunately, far too often the history of Gaelic Ireland is misinterpreted, wrong, or based on dubious assumptions or prejudices. Although the internet makes this worse, it is a problem that goes back very far indeed. One example is Geraldus Cambrensis' famous work, but so too is the infamous claim that there was a potato goddess in pre-Christian Ireland. Moreover, many common misconceptions can be traced back to the rise of Romanticism and later nationalism in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Before entering into the myths about Gaelic history, I think it's important to pause and show you a range of good books on the subject. Among the authors are Hiram Morgan, John McGurk, John McCavitt, James O'Neill, David Edwards, Kenneth Nichols, Catherine Sims, Elizabeth Fitzpatrick, Matthew Stout, Sean Duffy, Claire O'Dowd, and many, many, many others. Two collections are particularly important: Gaelic Ireland 1250 to 1650 and Becoming and Belonging in Ireland 1200 to 1600. I'll leave precise details of these in the notes to this video. I would also recommend listening to the Irish History, Irish Medieval History, and History Ireland podcasts, and of course using the treasure trove that is the UCC Celt site, which contains a huge collection of Gaelic texts and the translations of many, including the majority of the Gaelic annals. Now, on with the fun. Number 5 in the myths about Gaelic history is the romantic nationalist picture produced in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which continues to have an impact today, resulting in a distorted historical account. One of the biggest effects of this is the idea that Gaelic Ireland was an archaic, non-modern, and doomed culture. There are many others. Some are simple but annoying, such as the idea that Gaelic lords used a definite article in their names, i.e., they were called the O'Neill, the O'Donnell, etc. This is not true. Looking back at English sources, these lords were referred to as O'Neill, O'Donnell, etc. In Gaelic sources, the same applied. Ru O'Donnell was O'Donnell, not on O'Donnell. This can easily be seen in the final paragraph of the Annals of the Four Masters, which refers to the death of Hugh O'Neill. The Irish part of this reads: O'Neill, A. MacFiordacha, McCune, Vaucig, McCune, McHenry, McOwen, August G. Ro Guerra, O'Neill. The English translation of this reads: O'Neill, Hugh, son of Ferdacha, son of Combacach, son of Con, son of Henry, son of Owen, who was afterwards styled O'Neill. no sign of D O'Neill. Indeed, it would be a very interesting exercise to find out when this "the" was first used, but probably it was in a 19th century text. However, the idea took hold and still remains a widely held belief. Another aspect of this romantic nationalist perspective is a distorted picture of history, such as the traditional view of the Battle of Clontarf as an Irish triumph in a nationalistic war between the Gael and the Gaul, which eradicated Viking power in Ireland forever. The reality was far more complex, and I recommend listening to the Irish History podcast here, as this has a series which explains the background to the battle and the battle itself in great detail. Norse fought on both sides of this conflict. Indeed, the Norse of Limerick were fundamental in Brian Boru's rise to power. It's also important to note that the Norse had been defeated in Ulster long before this. Indeed, it has been argued since the 1970s that the success of the Ceann Owen in driving the Norse out of Ulster was detrimental to them in the long run. A final impact of this perspective has been to give an interesting post-mortem life to a small number of Gaelic Irish. Brian Boru was one of these, but so too are Gráinne Whale and Red Hugh O'Donnell. All three have been built into figures far different from what they were in life. There was no Red Hugh O'Donnell in his lifetime. He was A. Rue O'Donnell, or O'Donnell to the Gaelic Irish. To the English, he was O'Donnell or Hugh Roe. Red Hugh would only be born centuries later. The same applies to Gráinne Whale, the so-called pirate queen. She was Gráinne ní Mhailí, spelt in various ways, or perhaps Grace O'Malley to the English, but she would never ever have been referred to as the pirate queen. That would have been a death sentence for her. Elizabeth was very conscious of her status. Anyone styling themselves a queen would have been dealt with very quickly. Gráinne was a very able leader who skillfully defended her position in a complicated political scenario. But she was neither a pirate queen nor a nationalist fighter against Elizabeth. Indeed, her son Tibbot ní Long fought with the English in the 9 Years' War, afterwards becoming Viscount Mayo. It's also very doubtful whether Gráinne actually ever met Elizabeth. For some reason, Gráinne Whale is almost always the only woman mentioned in the traditional history of the end of Gaelic Ireland, when at this time there were a wide range of very powerful and interesting women, such as Lady Agnes Campbell and her daughter Fionnuala MacDonald, known as Inian Dove and mother of Red Hugh O'Donnell, Rose O'Toole, wife of Fiach MacHugh, and Catherine McGuinness, Countess Tyrone. Myth number 4, Celtic Ireland. Celtic music, the Celtic tiger, Celtic gods, even Celtic Christianity. The word Celtic is used so much in Ireland that to question it seems crazy. Yet, what does Celtic actually mean? It is now often used to mean non-English or from the Atlantic fringe, but in antiquity it meant something very different. Indeed, when the idea of Celtic first began to be rediscovered, more or less in the 17th century, the Gaelic Irish were explicitly excluded from being Celtic. However, in the 19th century the Irish became Celtic, and the name has stuck since. The Irish language is part of the Celtic language family, but does this justify using the name Celtic for Gaelic Ireland? The Gaelic Irish never saw themselves as Celtic, never had a Celtic identity, and never claimed any lineage with other Celtic groups such as the Welsh, Bretons or Gauls, with the exception of the Gaelic Scots. Indeed, in Gaelic mythology, the Milesians, as their legendary ancestors were called, had come from Spain, with an Egyptian bit being added on so their mythology could be tied into the biblical framework, something done by most European nations at the time. In addition, the English, Danish, Norwegian and Swedish are all part of the Germanic language family. Does this mean that all of these are Germans? To say so would be to devalue the concept of German. The same applies to the concept of Celtic. To throw it at half of Western Europe, at peoples who did not identify as Celtic, is very problematic and results in bad history. We can throw in Celtic Christianity here. In recent years, this has become a bit of a fashion and has appeared in many books. Yet, it means nothing. First, because Celtic here is meant as Irish, not as Welsh, Breton, or Iberian. Secondly, because it's based on the idea that Christianity in Ireland in the first millennium was something ahistorical and unchanging, and also very different from Christianity in the rest of Europe. In contrast with any book on early medieval Ireland, which shows how the Catholic Church developed and changed in Ireland, and indeed the conflicts within the Irish Church. It also draws on a concept that emerged in the Reformation, that the Church in Ireland was originally not Roman Catholic, but had been corrupted by Rome until the original Church was uncovered and freed by the Reformation. A deeply problematic idea, to say the least. The Church in Ireland almost always interacted with Rome. It was not something isolated or different. It also changed over time, like all human institutions. Finally, there is the idea of Celtic warfare. In other words, the idea that there was a particularly Celtic way of fighting innate to all Celts, ranging from Vercingetorix to the 9 Years' War, and then to the 1745 Rebellion and Culloden, and, in some versions, to the Confederates and the American Civil War. Yes, people have argued that. In this perspective, Celtic warfare consists of shock charges. No sophistication here. The Highland charge is said to be the epitome of this style of warfare, despite the fact that it was only developed in the 1640s, and this type of offensive charge was completely absent from the most successful Gaelic warfare, that fought in the 9 Years' War in Ireland. Myth number 3. Irish paganism. On the internet, all sorts of texts, videos and talks can be found about Irish paganism or Celtic religion. Although there is quite a bit of interesting research into pre-Christian religion in Ireland, too often this is drowned out by those who, despite a lack of solid evidence, categorically state that the Celts believed in this, the Druids did this, and the Celtic gods were X and Y. Let me give you 2 examples of this. First, the claim that Bridget was a Celtic goddess. Once again, this is an idea with 19th century roots. There was a Gaelic saint called Bridget. She existed. There is a large amount of evidence for this. However, there is very little evidence for a goddess with the same name. A few lines in one source, basically. There is, though, a similarity between Saint Bridget's name and other Celtic names, such as the Brigantines. There is a possibility, albeit a faint one, that in addition to the Christian Saint Bridget, there was a Gaelic goddess with the same name. Yet, based on a whisper of evidence, many people build arguments in which they categorically state that Bridget was a goddess. Many claim knowledge of a pagan past without a proper knowledge of the Irish language, Irish history, or Gaelic society. Fragments in writing are taken out of context and used to produce a fully fledged Celtic or Gaelic religion. Moreover, most of this is based on English language sources. A second example here is even worse. Nowadays, around St. Patrick's Day, on various parts of the internet, there can always be found someone arguing that the story of St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland is a metaphor for the expulsion or massacre of pagans from Ireland. Again, history and historical sources are abused here. A story that first appeared centuries after Patrick's death is used to invent a massacre that never happened. Sources which repeat tropes that first appear much later than St. Patrick and which are part of attempts of certain parts of the Irish Church to gain prominence are taken completely out of context, in other words abused, to create a completely false history. Evidence can be found about pre-Christian religion in Ireland, though this is rarely mentioned by most of those who talk about Celtic religion. Some of this can be seen simply by looking upwards, at holy mountains such as the Paps of Annu and Kerry. References can be found elsewhere to other aspects, such as Comcrua. However, most of this evidence comes down to us through a Christian lens. In other words, through the biases of Roman and other classical authors, as in the case of the Druids. Were there Druids in Ireland? It is impossible to say. There are references to them, but all in a Christian context, which implies knowledge of the long-standing Roman concept of them. Moreover, the Druids of England and Wales, especially as discussed by Tacitus in Agricola, may have had very little resemblance to the priesthood of Gaelic Ireland at the time. Undoubtedly, there were various types of priests or druids existing in pre-Christian Ireland. Yet, here we have to be humble and admit our ignorance. Yes, one can build an idea of religion in Gaelic Ireland at this time, drawing on sources taken in their context, archaeology and other evidence, but what we have to be clear that all we can offer is a possibility, not a certainty, not something we know for definite. Unfortunately, I think this would ruin many books. Complexity, confusion, and admitting not knowing something do not seem to be popular these days. Myth number 2, clans. Now we're heating up and some people will definitely begin to scream. I've seen many claim on the internet that Gaelic Ireland was a clan society and that all Gaelic Irish people were members of clans, without defining what a clan was though. This is a misrepresentation of a complex society and complex social organizations. Some academics do use the word clan. After all, it comes from an Irish word meaning family. It's an easy term to use, but what does it actually mean? More importantly, what does it mean now in the 21st century? Or better, what does the word clan mean after having passed through the kitsch given to it by Walter Scott and those who sell kilts and tartans? Even leaving the latter aside, since the emergence of Romanticism, clan has come to mean some sort of primitive or non-modern kinship group in opposition to modern political forms. Indeed, in Scotland, so many name groups are now claimed to be clans, whether of a Gaelic origin or not, that the word clan actually means little. Moreover, why did the Gaelic Irish and Gaelic Scottish have clans, but not the English? Several years ago, Stephen Ellis argued that in the north of England, certain kinship or name groups acted like clans. Indeed, some of these ended up being transplanted to Ireland. Yet, why are the O'Neills a clan but not the Tudors, or any other English aristocratic family? Is it because the O'Neills are from the Gaelic system that is presumed to be archaic and doomed to be replaced, doomed to be destroyed, but the Tudors are modern? This is probably one of the reasons, but it is wrong. In Tudor or Elizabethan England, there were a large number of families busy pursuing their own welfare, trying to gain the most benefit for themselves. These included the Percys from the north, but also the Cecils, the Essexes, and many, many others. The English nobility were brought under the control of the central state earlier in England than in Ireland or Scotland, but they often acted in similar ways. Clans in this sense means very little. Let us switch the focus back to Ireland. Gaelic Ireland was an extremely dynamic place. Lordship was not automatically inherited. Many lords would try to pass their power to a son, though not necessarily the firstborn. And they were not always successful in this. There were also numerous conflicts within kinship groups. While some scholars use the word clans, K.W. Nichols is the most prominent here, others reject this, preferring the word sept. This goes back to Owen MacNeill. Kinship was important, hence the numerous words in Irish for some sort of belonging, kennel, clan, etc., or the stress on lineage, and the forgery of this. Yet, this did not mean that every Gaelic person was a member of a clan. Kinship groups appear to have been important for elites. The Kennel Owen and later the O'Neills, or the Owenacht and the McCarthys, held large amounts of territory. But the vast majority of people in these territories, or even just in the central parts of the territories, would not have been O'Neills or McCarthys. The majority of people would have been ordinary people working in agriculture or elsewhere, with no shared kinship with their rulers. In important rituals, such as inaugurations, less important kinship groups O'Hannons, O'Sullivans, etc., who may or may not have some sort of kinship with the most important group, would have carried out important roles. Others would have occupied roles in administering the household, holding forts or castles, organising troops, etc. In other words, power in Gaelic Ireland was based on sophisticated lordships. These were administered by kinship groups, who very often fought among themselves, as can be seen in the numerous civil wars among the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, and among minor groups. Nor would there have been a sense that the head of the lordship was the head of a clan and thus responsible for a large extended family. There was a sort of social contract in operation, so that the head of a lordship had to protect all those under his power. If he failed to do so, they could look elsewhere for protection. Indeed, peasants often did this in an island where there was a lot of land and often a lack of labour. However, this was nothing to do with clans. While Gaelic lordships were poorer than most parts of England, France, or the Low Countries, they were not primitive areas out of touch with political, social, intellectual, military, or religious developments. Too often, the concept of clan is used in this way to indicate an unchanging social group. This dramatically misunderstands Gaelic society and history, and too often is based on a reading of a Gaelic text, taken out of context and applied to all of Gaelic history. Kinship groups dominate Gaelic history. They also dominated English history, French history, Spanish history, etc. Why then do we talk of Irish and Scottish clans, but the House of Hanover, the House of Habsburg, or even the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha? Finally, it's time to turn to myth number 1, Gaelic Ireland frozen in time. This is the idea that Gaelic, or worse, Celtic Ireland, is an unchanging, ahistoric society. It is something frozen in time somehow, rather than a real modern society which was evolving and changing, formed by a large number of people, by social classes and groups, and which was divided by conflicts like any society. It is reduced to something mythological or dead, something frozen and prevented from changing. It's also doomed to defeat. Gaelic Ireland changed. It transformed, it developed, it regressed. I could easily give a long list of changes Gaelic Ireland went through. Christianity and developments within Christianity. The emergence of ring forts and their abandonment centuries later. The Norse. The emergence of the Ineal and the alteration of the kingship of Tara, as well as attempts by various Ineal kings to achieve greater political power. These came close to fruition, but were defeated by the Norse. Brian Boru's usurpation of power, leaving behind a shattered high kingship, the Normans, the Gaelic reaction, and much, much more. Like any society, Gaelic Ireland was always changing. However, the idea of Gaelic Ireland as something mysteriously unchanging and unmodern is still clung to by many. Murray Pittock draws attention to this in his analysis of the end of Gaelic Scotland and the Jacobite rebellions of 1745 and 1715. He identifies what he calls the myth of the Gaelic clans, which in addition to other elements combines historiographical neglect, sentimental nostalgia, and glamorous primitivism. This can be applied to Gaelic Ireland. However, this perspective dramatically misunderstands Gaelic and Irish history. It advocates something simple, a binary view, usually Ireland against Britain, that never existed, and overlooks the complexity and contradictions of a modern society. One that was on the periphery, that was often persecuted and suffered considerably, but which was as modern as any part of Europe. It was not isolated politically, economically, or militarily from other events and movements elsewhere in Europe. This may seem basic, but unfortunately, it needs to be constantly stated and restated. I hope you've enjoyed listening to my views on these myths. Feel free to disagree with me, but get reading first. If you want to cut me to shreds, feel free to do so, but I want arguments based on evidence. However, this involves more than simply saying that according to Brehon law or a particular annal, that all Gaelic Irish always behaved in a certain way is not evidence. Context counts a lot. Just because something is stated in a law does not mean that society obeys this. Often, the opposite is the case. Happy reading.